we're going to be going over case law that supports learning science, how to add that to your training, and while you're already working with material that you already have. So one of the things that we need to consider is that there's actually a lot of case law out there. And it's a series that's on my profile where I talk about case law that supports learning science. But also, the thing that's very important about this is that in a lot of the courses that I still evaluate for an international training organization, is that a lot of it still violates case law. When Bill and Jamie both, I've worked with developing, helping them go through and fix courses that they're already delivering, that they were surprised that there's case law to support. So we're going to talk about the different types of cases. We're going to talk about some of the things that are covered in the case law. And then Bill and Jamie are going to talk about how they've implemented that into their courses as it is. Because a lot of people think, well, there's all this case law. I'm going to have to redesign and build everything just to fit this case law in. And it's not the case. It's going to be a lot easier to add things as you go. In between your iterations of delivery, start adding pieces and parts, but document everything so that you have an excuse, or not even an excuse, you have a reason for why you're making those changes. Because all it's going to do is make your courses stronger. And if you ever get challenged in any kind of liability, you're going to have this case law to back you up. Well, why are you doing it this way? We're doing it because this case law, because Zuchel v. Denver said that decision making and training in as close to reality as possible is necessary for training. So that's what we're going to cover today. And I'd like to give a quick opportunity for Bill and Jamie to say their piece real quick. What they're intending on delivering in this episode, and also the things that they've struggled with.
I'll go. Oh yeah, I'll go ahead and start. So obviously, including case law into my trainings has always been something that I've always done. What case law do we include in most use of force things, Graham versus Connor, and things like that? So I know a lot of that case law and how it works out for us when we're teaching officers. But how does that actually apply to training and your instructional design, and how do you build courses that fall in line with case law? I didn't know a lot of that stuff until Rick came out to my course and had his rubric, and part of his rubric and went through several different case laws, and I was like, I don't even know what these case laws are. Luckily, I was falling in line with the case laws and did exactly what they had said anyway. So I learned a lot from Rick on those case laws, and it's important when you are designing classes that you fall within those, especially when it comes to the documentation and when it comes to the liability if someone were ever to come back on you and try to sue you for any of your courses that you're doing. If you have that case law to back you already, then you're going to be good. So I'm grateful for Rick. I'm still learning from him a lot, and so I'm actually today hoping to learn a lot from this conversation and continue to improve my courses and how they're designed so that my students get the best out of it, and I'm also protecting myself as I'm teaching.
You're up, Bill. Are you with us? Oh, we can't hear you. So while Bill's figuring out his audio, he decided to use a new mic that's going to make him sound even more sexy than he already does on his videos. One of the things that this is all about, this is about liability, direct and vicarious liability. And it's something that a lot of instructor courses cover. They say vicarious liability exists, don't do it. And then they move on to other stuff. But they don't give you any of the information or any of the documentation that tells you what it is that you have to worry about. In most circumstances, people think vicarious liability only applies to physical things like EVOC, firearms, and DT. Vicarious liability is discussed a little bit in use of force when we're talking about Graham v. Connor or PIMS and such like that, where we're violating civil rights as far as vicarious liability. However, vicarious liability applies to a lot more than that. And a lot of instructors are getting hung up on that. And court cases, there are cases working through right now where they're starting attorneys are getting smart enough because they want that dollar. They want to get that dollar and they want to screw a cop as much as they can. And that's, you're not going to talk me off that hill. So what they're starting to do is they're starting to blend these things together. And while not all the court cases are SCOTUS settled, but the fact that they're settled in district and circuit courts does set it up for a challenge that will eventually get to SCOTUS. So if we're following precedent from other locations, that doesn't make it doesn't mean that because California does one thing, Florida doesn't need to do it. It means if we're doing all these things across the country, it makes it harder for any attorney to say, well, you're violating case law. Actually, I've gone above and beyond what our region requires because I'm using precedent from other states that set a higher standard than what we are currently operating with. Are you with us, Bill?
Yeah, I'm fine. I have audio issues for whatever reason. Well, I'm good now. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Gotcha
Yeah.
now.
Did you
Okay.
want to do a quick introduction to what we're talking about tonight?
Oh yeah, so learning a lot from Rick, and even like just talking with Jamie and guys like Ryan over in Arizona, including a lot of the case law, and not only in like my hands-on training and stuff like that, but using it to also help sell things to the department, especially when that word deliberate indifference comes up. It's helpful to kind of outline some things, showing that training requires decision making, and lack of that kind of starts to get into the gray area of, is it actually training? And I think like sometimes the administrations like to hear, or
But we just lost your audio again. Yeah, we lost you again. So technology's been kicking our butts. We're trying to find more efficient, clean ways of doing this so that y'all have a better experience. And it's just kicking our butts left and right. Are you back? Are you back,
dude,
Bill?
what the? Yeah,
There we
yeah.
go.
This is the problem with getting a bunch of cops on trying to do technology.
Like, hey, I found
Really.
a great idea. Nope, it's trash.
It I don't know what's happening, but I don't know where I lost you, or where you lost me, I should say.
You're extolling the virtues of working with me, I think.
Now you were talking about just bringing it up to command staff and things like
Oh,
that
that's right.
to make it work.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, I think when I first started doing this, obviously like the Graham v. Connor, Tennessee versus Garner stuff jumps out to include in your training and stuff like that. But as you dig a little deeper, talking to Rick, there's like essentially case law for everything if you dig deep enough, and then using that to kind of sell the admin on progressive change and actually doing training the way it's supposed to be done, which is with decision making. And throwing the word deliberate indifference around usually helps motivate a little bit. So it's something that you could also use to one. It's an educated approach to selling the administration on something they might not even know about, and two, like one of the biggest things that we're seeing is
Everybody's on a
oh,
roll every time.
we got you, Bill. You're
We
gone
lost you
again.
again.
He's not even looking. He's gonna start. We're gonna see him use the impaler here in a second. So, while Bill's figuring out his technology, why don't we go ahead and jump into it? Bill has a lot of great things to say, and we'll catch up to him when he's feeling secure with his audio. I figured the best way to go about this is to essentially go through each of the case law that's in the book. That's one of the things is I've already seen a lot of the comments about case law as it relates to what police are doing on the road, like Tennessee v. Garner and Terry stops and Canton v. Ohio, that kind of stuff. The thing is, though, is that what we're talking about is case law specific to training. We don't hear a lot about case law that dictates how training should be designed and what has to be in training. And that's the blind spot that we have in a lot of instructor courses and in our training materials, because the training materials haven't kept up with it. For instance, Popal v. City of Margate is the first court case that tied civil liability to law enforcement training. And it was based off of a bad shooting. And it comes from a precedent setting case called Monell v. Department of Social Services, 1978. So they've been dealing with how training is being done since 1978. And what Monell v. Department of Social Services did is it eliminated the protections of being able to sue government industry or government jurisdictions, government agencies, and such like that. Popow v. Margate actually extended it into law enforcement. So the what Popow v. Margate opened up was training needs to reflect the job task expectations and needs to be repetitive. We need to have regular training of the same things on a constant basis. This supports learning science that repetition builds retention. So Margate showed us that our training can't just be one and done. How much of that training are we doing now? We've got all that checkbox stuff. It has to be done on a regular basis. Now, I know Jamie's agency does a lot of this with active shooting. What are they doing, Jamie?
So our agency is actually ahead of the curve in a lot of ways, but repetitive training, we incorporate the same types of training almost every training. Every training has some aspect of DT. Every training has some aspect of active shooter, immediate action teams. We try to incorporate the things that cops are going to do the most and the most high risk into our quarterly trainings. So we're a big agency, around over 900 officers, and our trainings, we're able to do quarterly trainings, 4 hours a week, or sorry, 4 hours a quarter for every officer. And we try to build off of each training for the year. So everything rolls into the next thing. So we continue to keep it repetitive. So we're not just this month, we're going to teach you how to work on the computer. This month, we're going to do de-escalation. Like everything builds on it throughout the year. And we also apply the same concepts with our range and with our DT program. And so that everybody's constantly on the same page as we're building those programs out.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. So the point is that you're not just doing one and done. Qualifications isn't the only training that your agency is getting on firearms.
And
Pop
qualifications
out.
aren't training anyway.
Yeah,
You
exactly,
said it.
exactly. That's I had finger quotes. I don't know if it could show
Yeah.
up on there. So one of the things, if you as instructors, you want to have training that you do repetitively, this is going to be the court case that you can take to your admin and say, we need to do this stuff more regularly, and here's the court case that established it. Now, I believe this is a SCOTUS one. And it was SCOTUS because it was under 42 USC 1983, civil rights violation. And what the court said, an official policy or custom which was, I'm sorry, I'm reading ahead of myself. Yeah, sorry, I got ahead of myself. But essentially, it needs to be repetitive and it needs to be realistic. So scenarios that are aliens dropping from the sky and pirates popping out of the sewer and terrorists jumping out of every van, how realistic is that? But having to talk to people about, what the policy is regarding a domestic dispute. My kids aren't being returned home on time. You have to do repetitive training on that too. That's a civil issue in the state, in the Commonwealth that I worked in. Sorry, that's a civil issue. Practicing those kind of things, going over your SOPs. That is training also, as long as you're going over it and you have other elements of training involved as well. Bill, do you have anything about Pop v. Margate?
I actually really like that case. It's one of the ones that I used for like low light shooting and stuff like that to help kind of push that because we don't get enough of. I don't think anybody gets enough of it really. It's often overlooked. And one of the things that I used to sell some agencies, not some agencies, but my old agency, was about how like static range qualifications in and of themselves are not considered training and are insufficient. You need more than that because they were okay with go to the range, do your annual qual. That's considered training. You're done. This case helped me explain to them that that wasn't accurate, which then allowed for, not just me alone, but me in a group of people, get extra, we ended up doing 2 range days per fiscal year, which was two to 4 range days per fiscal year, which was largely training other than the qual. So the qual was like you show up, you do your qual cold, you get it out of the way. The rest of the day is legitimate actual training. So that was the easy way to help move that forward. That's how I use that case, and I really and you could apply it to a lot of other things too.
I think it applies to every aspect of what we do, whether you're
Yeah,
at the range, whether you're DT. How often do agencies do defensive tactics training? Most agencies never.
never. Yeah,
And
I
I just did a post
at
the other day.
zero.
Yeah,
Yeah,
most agencies don't, and they wonder why we have so many issues with use of force around the country, and so many videos of officers doing it wrong or getting themselves hurt or being too excessive in what they do. They don't get the training in that, and I think this case is a perfect example of how if you're a DT instructor in your agency, understand this case, know how it applies to you, know how it applies to how you can build your case to get more training hours for your department. And I just did a post the other day, a reel the other day about uh, active shooter training and crisis entry training. That is patrols hostage rescue.
yeah.
When I was on
yeah,
the SWAT team, we trained hostage rescue every week. That was a mandatory thing, if not a couple times a week. Every week was hostage rescue training. Why? Because it's the most important thing that we did, and we had to be perfect at it. How often do officers get active shooter training? Departments are getting better at it, but do they train crisis entry? And we're seeing that over and over again where officers have to go in now. They don't have time to wait. How often are they getting the training to leave their patrol car from an immediate action team or show up on a DV call and have to breach a door and get entry into that? And how do they move through the structure? You don't have time to wait for the SWAT team. Why aren't we training that? And that's another thing you can go back on this case law with and say, hey, we need more of this type of training because when was the last time we did it? Oh, we haven't.
yeah.
This is what officers are facing, and this is the most important thing that they're going to do because it has to be perfect now.
And that one case alone, how many agencies are violating a case that was settled by SCOTUS in 1979? I think overwhelmingly most agencies are not doing repetitive training, and they're not doing repetitive training that reflects the job expectations. So the piece that I got ahead of myself on was the decision that SCOTUS set up a two-part. Monell created the two-question test for whether a municipality has liability under 42 USC section 1983. Number one, an official policy or custom which results in constitutional violations, or conduct by officials in authority evincing implicit authorization or approval or acquiescence in the unconstitutional conduct. So if they're not training people, they're violating Monell, and they've established that as the custom and policy of the agency, that they don't care that
Mhm.
there might be people violating the constitutional rights of others. So that's where I was getting ahead of myself. So that's something that administrators will understand very easily. Our agency is going to be held liable, and our instructors will not be held liable, and our personnel will not be held liable because you are not allowing us to have repetitive training in the skills that we're using on the road, more often.
How often, so with that, obviously they don't give timelines, they don't give how often you are supposed to train, but what are how often are you guys seeing other agencies train or putting things other than the qual into their training to make it
Oh
repetitive?
man,
Yeah.
if I'm being honest, it's terrible. At least where I'm at. What I it, not speaking for everybody. There are a few departments that stand out, and the only reason I've had experience with multiple departments in training in the state was through the Officer Survival Series. We'd go, like, departments would hire Rob to go run their DT program for the department. We'd go and help. And then we used to do a regional in-service. So between those two things, I got to see like a lot of different departments in the state and see kind of what they were working with, including state police, which I think they do a better job at. But largely, what I see still to this day in my state is the block style training, 8 hours, which really is like five after you include the breaks. And it's material that is not built on, and it's the same material every year. They'll get that in their 8 hours, and then they'll come back again the next year, and it's the same material. And it's and they wonder why. I remember hearing some training officers complain, "Why do I have to do the same thing every year? They never remember it." It's like, yeah, yeah, no shit. Like
Hmm.
you said something for 20 minutes, and then they don't hear it again for an entire year. How can you expect anybody to retain that? So I see it as a huge issue in the state. It's getting better because the model in which we've been teaching DT has been, we've seen like, once we've started to see success on body cameras, people start asking questions like, what's going on here? And the answer is consistent trade, a little bit, a lot. And that has been probably the forefront of that. Everything else, even firearms, is not even close. It's pretty bad.
Yeah, as I've traveled around all over the place, it's the same thing.
Yeah,
Most people don't get any training. If they do get training, it is the qual, and that's it. Or they'll get, hey, we're doing our yearly training, and guess what they're learning how to do? Use the new computer program that the department spent way too much money on. And
yep,
that's their 8 hours of training that they get for the year. And I think you said it perfect. Train a little, a lot. A briefing training. How often do you officers go to briefing and just bitch about things that aren't happening, the things that they're mad about,
yeah.
they have to work extra. Why is I'm working swing shift? Why is the day shift already at the station? I'm trying to get ready and all this stuff. They just bitch about things. When hey, instead of complaining about stuff, let's spend 30, 40 minutes doing some defensive tactics. Let's do 30, 40 minutes. Hey, let's just clear the building. Let's do a building search of the station just for a little bit of training. Do that for 20 minutes. Hey, let's all go together into the bay and do some dry fire training. Just the few of us for 10 minutes and get those skills down. And I think you'll see a better result out of that, and sergeants and leaders that will do a little bit of training with their guys rather than an 8 hour training for the entire year that they don't really get anything out of because they forget half of it by the time the training's over.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. It was not SCOTUS on that. By the way, I want to correct myself. It was the U.S. District Court for District of New Jersey that settled when Papa v. Margate.
Glad you clarified that.
Yeah, hate being wrong, but if I
But
have to
it's
be, at least I'm wrong with
Out
people
of
I respect.
like, yeah,
but
totally good, totally fine.
Rick, the I think the important thing is with that though is that it seems like it did significantly influence the Canton v. Harris case
Yeah,
for SCOTUS. So I without that, I think there was no framework for them to work off of on the
yeah.
Harris case.
And that's exactly the point that we're getting to, is that these cases, it doesn't matter if it's just a district court or if it's a federal appeals court, they're building on each other and they're influencing other court cases. They're influencing other materials. And so we need to be aware that just because it was settled in New Jersey, it can be applied across the country if an attorney gets a piece of it.
Hmm.
So I'm in the process of pulling up all my citations so I don't get it wrong again.
It's
But
okay.
what's that?
I said it's okay.
Yeah, it's okay for you. Don't you know if I'm an instructor, I have to be perfect every time. I can be irrefutable.
Ugh. You never miss.
So
Smooth on that trigger.
Yeah,
yeah,
nice smooth trigger pull. Surprise! Make sure it surprises you when it breaks.
maybe I just need to talk slower so I can talk smoother. All right, so that's the first piece of ammo that you can take to your agency: repetitive and realistic to the job. The second case that,
Real quick, let's touch on that second part of that because we talked about repetitive. But
yeah.
how often have you gone to trainings in your department or seen trainings throughout the country that is unrealistic?
Oh, yeah, a
Where
lot.
Oh, yeah.
and let's specifically talk about active shooter training since that's my forte. I've been to so many active shooter trainings and I've had people call me, "Hey, we're doing some active shooter training. Come watch it. Come see what we're doing." And it's so unrealistic to what has actually happened. They just there's a bomb here or there's you go from this room to this room to this room and there's bad guys in every corner. It's like,
Yeah.
is that really active shooter training? Because look at all the active shooters that have happened around the country and none of it is what you're actually doing. So how about we teach it the way we're actually seeing it happen?
And there's only been one active shooter that involved two people, and that's the one that started
There's
everything,
there's been
Columbine.
there's been a very small few, but
Exceptionally. Yeah.
yeah, but it's like
But
98% of them are one person.
but instead the active shooter training is like you're raiding an ISIS school where
It's
every
like it's
teacher's a
Mumbai.
terrorist. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like it's Mumbai or Beslan, which
Yeah.
that hasn't happened. And yes, we need to be prepared for that. But if you understand the basics of how the movements go, you'll be okay with that. So,
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So
and let's talk about defensive tactics. And like in the academy, they have like red man scenarios where the guy gets dressed up in the suit and just beats the crap out of the recruits. How
yeah.
realistic is that? How about you make it more scenario based and now make the recruits or your officers, if you're going to put them through that, make it like a scenario, like they go have to go hands on with somebody and make it more realistic to what they actually deal with on the street.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I'll even go with that. Like baton training is that thing you could just throw it right in the garbage.
Uh-huh.
It does nothing, and it's so strange to me that we have to do 11 hours of baton training at the academy. 11 hours. It's wild to me. We're not mandated to do active shooter training in the academy, but we have to teach how to swing a stick for 11 hours. And in that, it's like hitting bags and doing this. And then I look at the use of force stats for the state for baton use in the past 5 years, and it's been like two. I'm like, what are we
Yeah.
doing? Not only is the training unrealistic, but this thing is so antiquated, it's not even getting used. Most departments aren't even requiring people to use it. It's like, why is this thing even required, and why are we spending so much time on it? It doesn't it drives me nuts. But yeah, all of that stuff is typically, even sometimes I've been to other academies where they're doing their scenario training day, and they're doing a car stop, and they go up on the car, and then the recruit is dealing with whatever, and then a dude pops out of the trunk with like a sim gun and does all this, and he's like, you should have checked the trunk. It's like, what are we doing? Like, what, why are you, how many times? And the annoying thing is, like, if I put those role players as a student in that scenario, they would mess it up just as bad as the
Mhm.
recruits, but they use it as a way to like impose their will and show that they're better than them over it. And it drives me nuts because having put some of those guys through in service, I'm like, I've seen how you performed on the range and in the mat room, and I know you ain't doing any better than that. And a lot of the times it's very, very unrealistic.
And,
Let's let's let- let's go straight into firearms. Now that we've talked about
Yeah.
DT and some tactic stuff. Standing on the line, slow trigger press. How realistic is that? Move one step to the left. How realistic is that? People need to start, all these red shirts need to start getting with the time and look at videos. And we have so much body worn camera now. Start looking at videos of officer involved shooting. See how officers actually react. Are they getting that surprise break? No, they're pounding on that trigger. So how about we work on getting officers good at that and make that repetitive and get them good at build drills and different things like that rather than, hey, we're gonna put a one little tiny hole through that the entire paper, and if you go outside of this little hole, you're bad. No, let's make it more reasonable, more realistic, and get better training value out of it.
Going off of that, there's I pulled up some numbers, just averages about officer involved shootings. And it's funny, you look at the numbers, right? The average distance is 0 to 10 feet. They last less than 5 seconds. The officer is shooting second, so they're reacting. right? And then during that time, they're shooting multiple rounds, largely from two-handed shooting positions, and then the second highest percentage is around 40% strong hand only, with a less than 5% of a support hand only shooting position. So if we look at that, almost 3 yards, right, in less than 5 seconds, shooting second, reacting. That sounds really close to a bill drill,
Yeah.
really close. And
Hmm.
so when we look at that, and then we take our range qualification and our range training, let's shoot 7 rounds from the 7 yard line in 45 seconds. Get out of here. Get out of here. That's insane.
And you have two
And
minutes to reload.
it doesn't make any sense. And like, is that in and of itself, like you have this data that shows this, and then you have our training that shows this. Is that in and of itself deliberately indifferent? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
I
they,
would
they
say
don't
yes.
match. It's very clear. I mean, to me, but I know I'm just a peon, so.
A well-knowledge beyond. But we've spent half an hour on the first case. So
That's a good
it's,
one.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's the thing that sets up everything else because
Yeah.
that one case is based off of SCOTUS, the SCOTUS Monell v. Department of Social Services, and a lot of stuff has been based off of Papa v. Margate. So the next one we want to talk about, which I've everyone I've talked to has never heard of this case. If somebody else has heard of this case, it's great. But when I read this case, I was like, holy crap, that was half of my basic training was violation of Spell v. McDaniel, 1985, out of Federal Appeals Court, Fourth Circuit. It's essentially, in a nutshell, Spell is a cop in I believe, Florida, arrests a drunk McDaniel. McDaniel kind of steps up some, and Spell delivers some street justice to the point where he kicks McDaniel so hard in the testicles that he ruptures one of his testicles. So when I went to court, Spell said, "That's how we were trained. We were told about street
Mm.
justice. Said, I can't be held accountable." And during the investigation, they found that even though they had policy that said you cannot be violent to people, it was kind of a wink wink policy. So it created a situation called custom and use. Official policy is not the only basis for imposing liability. Custom and usage may also serve. Custom and usage includes persistent and widespread practices by agents and employees that occur with enough duration and frequency which warrants actual or constructive knowledge by the leaders without correction so that they have become customary among employees. The way in which a municipal police force is trained, including the design and implementation of training programs, and the follow-up supervision of trainees is necessarily a matter of policy within the meaning of liability. To the extent of a particular training policy is fairly attributable to a municipality if it's, quote, official municipal policy. To the extent such an official municipal policy has deficiencies resulting from municipal fault and then causes specific constitutional violations by deficiently training police officers, the municipality is liable. In a nutshell, it says that how you design your training matters. This is instructional design. This case is 1985. It's been 40 years, and we still get instructional design courses that are create an outline, create a PowerPoint, 10-question quiz, you're done. Oh, throw some performance objectives in there. It specifically said 1985 there has to be course design. The other thing that it says is that anything that you say as an instructor or anything that you do not have in your instructor material constitutes policy if it's not corrected by the agency. So every time I had somebody come into my course or into my basic and say, well, the course material I was given is not how it really is on the street. I'm going to tell you how it is on the street. That instructor now has set custom and usage policy for the agency, for the academy, and every person that uses that information is now going to rest entirely on the instructor. What that means is all your course materials, especially if you're going to create train the trainer course materials, need to have the need to have all the content that they need to talk about. Now, a lot of people say, "Well, I don't want to teach from a script." How many teachers read a textbook in school? They don't. The textbook sets the boundaries of you have to cover this. That way you have documentation that says this is what people are trained, because that now becomes policy. How much training is doing that? When you have a 40-hour course that is that's covered with 8 pages of bullet points, that's not policy. You're what's happening in between the bullets. This is probably the seminal case for why I advocate for the courses being developed the way I do, that all my course materials are narrative, because if you're going to do especially train the trainer programs, or if you're going to create course materials for other people to deliver, they need to know what the boundaries are. So if they go off script, if they go outside the boundaries, that instructor owns the liability, not the agency. If they don't cover material that's in the material, but your participant guide includes all that same narrative material, the recruit now owns every piece of it. So this was huge because we had an instructor that would talk about all of his fights, and a lot of the fights he talked about were unconstitutional. But there were guys who were going out and doing as this one instructor who eventually was fired for refusing to take a rape call or take a rape report, telling the girl she probably wanted it anyway. This is the guy who was training recruits, and he was constantly just doing whatever he wanted to. So Spelvey McDaniel is absolutely crucial to how you're creating your documentation, because your documentation becomes policy. So that's one of the things that Jamie and I have talked a lot about,
Mhm.
and Bill and I have talked a lot about. So go ahead and talk about how you're implementing that in your training now, because you're both actively training as you're updating your materials to follow just this one case law.
Yeah, so that was one of the big things that hit me hard when Rick came and did my evaluation of my course. Was I thought my design was good. I had a really worked on knowing he was coming. I didn't try to change a whole lot because I just wanted to see how it was with him just coming out. But I added a little bit to my lesson plan to make sure I crossed my I's and dotted my T's. And once we sat down with the rubric and we talked about this case law, I realized, man, I have a whole long way to go. I didn't have participant guides. And I was like, well, why wouldn't I need a participant guide? I don't do PowerPoints. My PowerPoint was less than an hour long, and it was mainly going over a couple different cases, and there's like 10 slides because I'd rather just go out there and do the training and rep it out over and over again. So I'm like, well, what? Trying to give a participant guide to my students, it doesn't really do me any good because we're going to be out moving anyway. Once talking to Rick, talking about this case law, I realized, oh, they need to know the boundaries once they leave here. They need to know what I'm actually teaching them and not just go off of memory because 2 years down the road, they get into an active shooter situation. They do exactly what they thought that I taught them. And they say, well, I did this because Jamie taught me this. And I can be like, well, where's your participant guide? No, that's not exactly what I taught. And now I'm covered liability wise, but it's also something for them to take with them. And getting ready to and designing some train the trainer courses. Yeah, that stuff needs to be written out so that people know the parameters that they can go on because just points aren't good enough. Because you can take that bullet point and you can interpret it any way you want. So you need to have all the documentation written out really well so that people understand exactly what you did say so that you won't be held liable if they do something different.
Very good. And I've seen your participant guide since then, and it's come a long way, and it's
Mhm.
very well done.
Still got work to do, but it's getting there.
Yeah, just a little bit incremental change can
Hmm.
accomplish a lot.
Yep.
How about you, Bill?
Yeah, my participant guide is actually in the works as well. The first after reading your book and talking with you, realized that like what I had was not sufficient. So that is it is a lot of work, but it's worth it. And one thing that I found too, whether it would be firearms or DT, what I found useful about the participant guide stuff is that it also gives them a framework on what to train and how to train it once they leave the course, which speaks to like our consistency and stuff like that. So some helpful things to throw in the participant guides could also be like useful during downtime. So if there's downtime during the training that you're doing and they have the participant guide, whether it's like, hey, we're gonna use this uh, little exercise within the participant guide to develop like a plan, or how we're going to organize assets and resources for follow-on units, and then things that are associated with the training that gets them engaged during the downtime is I found helpful. And then the last part, which was like towards the end of it, it's always good to have like resources, associates that you have that they know they can go to for follow-on stuff, in addition to like how do you train this once you leave here, like short little frameworks, drills for firearms, or like very basic scenarios for DT, how to set them up so that way they're not just winging it when they go back to the PD. They can use that guide to help them further their education on the long term.
And one of the things I learned too when we sat down, when Rick and I sat down with the rubric, I almost need 3 or 4 different types of lesson plans. The lesson plan that I go off of with the guys that I know that understand the material is kind of just an outline of how the course is going to go. But then need another lesson plan for the instructors that don't understand it so that they can read through it, know where to go, what they're actually supposed to be teaching. And then another lesson plan basically is the participant guide to give the students.
Hmm.
And you need multiple different lesson plans because we've all been in those courses where the instructor takes the lesson plan and reads from it. So I was always
Yeah.
opposed to writing a whole bunch of stuff in a lesson plan because I hate when instructors do that. So my lesson plans are pretty bullet pointish. But that's for the instructors that already know what they're talking about. You need the other one for those parameters for the instructors that don't know what they're talking about so that they understand what the bullet points actually are.
And that's something that's an argument I've made at a couple conferences when I've talked about background experience and training is only context for content. It's only context, not content. And one of the points I made is that, if you're part of a cadre and you have a brand new guy on your team who hasn't been through it yet, you all go to Chipotle and you have bad pork burritos except for him because he's a vegan and he just ate lettuce. Nobody can teach except for the one guy who doesn't have any experience. He has background and experience in training in active shooter. He doesn't have the experience with your course. I would rather that guy read from the narrative that we've created, even though it's not going to be as great as you delivering it or one of the guys that you've run with delivering it. But even somebody reading it directly out of the instructor guide is better than someone with a few bullet points that has no idea what to fill it in with. Because now they're
Yeah.
making stuff up and you have no idea if they're going outside the boundaries. So even the lowest common denominator of quality instructor, and I'm not going to talk about bad instructors because bad instructors are not going to change anyway. I'm talking about new instructors that you want to train them to how you want them to deliver stuff. They need to have that narrative format just as a fallback so that
Mhm.
you can start prepping the next instructor to know how it is. And as they get more confident, they don't need that instructor guide as much. The instructor guide just becomes a point of referral that if they aren't feeling well, or if they're distracted, they can keep track of where they are in the material. So it's the instructor guide is being narrative format, and then making the participant guide nothing more than the instructor guide without all the instructor notes. Now the participants have everything that the instructor is delivering, and they can be held responsible for it as well. They can be held accountable because consistency, continuity equals accountability. They can be held accountable because it was delivered to them and they were given the material as reference for them down the road if they want to continue developing, or as evidence that they ignored it and went off on their own.
Mhm.
So do y'all have anything more to add? I was going to move on to the next case.
No, that's pretty good.
Okay. So Graham v. Connor. We hear a lot about that regarding training, but I don't know if a lot of people actually understand what, I'm sorry, not Graham v. Connor, City of Canton, Ohio v. Harris, Canton v.
Mhm.
Harris, 1989. The result of that, for those anyone in training and most people in law enforcement should be aware of this. This was the establishment of deliberate indifference and wanton disregard, right? The thing is, but the learning aspect of this is this is the case law that establishes the need for a performance task analysis, because the SCOTUS said that they should have reasonably been aware that their people needed training in this kind of activity. They need to be reasonably aware that whoever's overseeing the holding cell should be trained in how to identify medical issues. All of that comes from a performance task analysis. But how much training are we creating that's just based off of us staring at the wall, thinking about what would I do in this case, and then writing it down? It's completely based on memory. That means that we get to own every piece that we're putting into that training. Now, one of the things I really liked about Jamie's training is that he has a crap ton of experience as a SWAT team member. He has a crap ton of experience doing hostage rescue and responding to incidents and stuff. But his course was not based off of what would Jamie do. It was based off of research, observation, and analysis of active shooter events across the country. He took the time to interview and talk to the people who were involved with some of them. He got to know some of the people, and we've, even in this course, you learn that there's a lot of people talking about things they've done that they actually didn't do, and the guys who actually did it aren't talking at all. So if you're basing it off of our training needs to be based off of a performance task analysis, which includes research and observation. Go ahead and talk more about that, Jamie.
Yeah, and it kind of goes back to there's all kinds of different methods to do things. So the way I would work with a SWAT team is different than the way I would work with an active shooter with a patrol guy rolling with me. So how do you teach that? How do you teach the difference? You stick to the principles of what you're trying to teach, and then go off of that. Uh, and the way I try to design that course is exactly that. How do I keep it simple enough so people can understand, but also realistic enough to where they're going to actually do the job? I've been to some active shooter trainings recently uh, that weren't based on reality, that were based on theory and complete opposite of some of the cases that we've seen over the last 10 or 15 years. And they were still doing things that they were doing 15 years ago. And they haven't looked at the current cases, what the suspects are doing, how the officers are responding, where they're getting shot at from, where they're standing in the room, and things like that. And if you take all of those experience and you study each one of those active shooter incidents, you can start to see a pattern and some different tactics that will work for that. And just because I've been to a few different active shooter incidents and each one was different, but the responses were all similar. So if we can keep it based on that and the similarities and not kind of the off the wall things, you're going to be able to teach better and help people understand better how to do the movements when it actually comes down to it.
Absolutely. Bill, what have you talk about? You've been doing a ton of research on your use of force training.
Yeah, I've been doing a lot with the use of force, and I'm going to tie it into DT so I don't oversaturate the firearms active shooter stuff. But with the DT, it's the same thing. Like, and I'll give you the case of my state in Connecticut. So for I want to say 20 years or more, we had a DT program in the state that was the only program that was used. And over that 20 plus years, we had a whopping zero body camera or any camera footage of any of those things that were taught being used in the street. And it took, my coach a very long time to get the program up and running. But one of the key deciding factors of that was sitting down with people at Post and saying, like, hey, we're trying to transition this program. Show me one video of any of that stuff being effective in real life, and they couldn't produce one, and that was the tipping point. And so when we do the training for DT now, it used to be, hey, we have to go through everything. We got to teach them how to punch and how to retain guard and do all this stuff, and then we're looking at, like, what are we seeing happen? What are our statistics showing us? What are we seeing on body camera? And it's not all that stuff. It's like people aren't able to put people in handcuffs as a team. People aren't able to restrain someone, take the will out of them. People aren't able to, like, capitalize on moments that they can use force sooner instead of prolonging it and making it worse. So once we looked at what's actually happening and we started to drill that, and then we realized like, oh wow, we actually don't have to teach that much new material. We just have to teach these things a lot more often.
Mhm.
And once we did that, we start to see a significant increase in success when they go into their scenario days, and it's all congruent because then if your scenario days are based off of things that we're seeing and they're realistic, you're going to see success from them being trained in the DT. Same thing with the firearms, and it's all circular. It all comes back around, and you see a lot of success there. If one of those things is not congruent with that, you're going to see inconsistencies. You're going to see things that aren't effective, and it's not going to work out well. So that's how I've seen it on the DT side. Hopefully that kind of paints a little bit of a picture on that.
Yeah, absolutely. The task performance analysis isn't just in how are people shooting, how are people fighting, how are people driving. It's also I use this example a lot. If there was a true, we hear about states that are like, oh, we're doing a task analysis on law enforcement training, and then they come out with a unified basic training course. And I can tell you 100% of the time that they're not doing a performance task analysis, that their task analysis is 100% based off surveys, because if they did, the number one thing that they would teach is the number one in every academy is the number one thing that people are doing first out of the academy, and the first thing that most FTOs that I've talked to say every recruit sucks at right out of the academy, and that's basic communication.
Mhm.
They can't talk on a radio. They don't have radio ear. If they were doing a performance task analysis, that would be the number one thing that they would pinpoint is that what do they do most of every call? They're on the radio. They're communicating. So how come communication and radio traffic and radio control is not the first thing taught? And it wouldn't be that difficult to do. You issue everybody one of those $30 Motorola radios at the beginning of a course, and you go over how to talk on a radio. And then if somebody has a question, unit 556 to instructor, and the instructor says, go ahead, 556. And that's how they start doing they get that radio ear. It wouldn't be that difficult. But Canton v. Harris establishes that a performance task analysis has to be done for all of the tasking that we're doing. But most of the training that we're developing, except for a few dudes like you two, are basing it off of what they reflect on, not on what they're observing people to do. So instructors should be doing ride-alongs. They could do 2 unit calls. They could go out and just document what is everybody doing. They could focus on specific things. They're like, we're going to do a performance task analysis on domestics, violent or non-violent, doesn't matter, and just document every step and every activity that they do to latch onto the things to make domestic training far superior, far much better.
I think you both kind of touched on something that I want to bring up, the importance of learning from mistakes and then
Yeah,
applying it in training, because
lessons
everything you
learned.
guys already talked about it, it's the lessons learned, not from the good stuff that we did and like, oh, look at me, I can train this because I'm really good at it. Let's look at the lessons learned from the mistakes that officers have made. And when we do that and then now adjust our training based on that, just like you did with DT, okay, what are they actually failing at and what are they actually using that they need to work on instead of worrying about all the extra stuff, then your training is going to become better. And with the internet, with body worn cameras, it's so easy now to, when you got companies and organizations like Officer Involved and the body worn camera library, you can pull all kinds of things up and do base your training what you want to teach on a lot of those things. Learn, look at the lessons learned, look at the mistakes made, not Monday morning quarterbacking it, but learning from the mistakes that they made and now applying that to your training. How can we fix it so the officers don't continue to make those mistakes?
Jamie, that's a really good point, and I advocate for anyone who's at their agency in a training position should have access to view all the officers' camera footage,
Hmm.
and when instructors are putting together those trainings and trying to learn from mistakes, one of the best things that you can do, especially if you're trying to change a program or change curriculum and you need authorization to do that, use your own agency's body cameras
Hmm.
and their
Yeah,
incidents to help change that. Stop using, if I if and especially it engages more with the students too. Like if I'm teaching something in Connecticut and I'm using camera footage from Phoenix, it might be a good example of what I'm explaining, but the second they realize it's not from the area, they start to lose a little bit of credibility on me. Is like, why is he showing me a video from Phoenix? And
Hmm.
it speaks more to the students, but it really speaks to the admin of that agency when you could say, hey, we've had 560 calls of domestic violence this last month, and 70% of them have ended in injuries. Of those injuries, we're attributing to physical force. These are areas that we can improve on. Everyone was making this mistake. I have a block of training that addresses that. If someone says no to that, like, I don't, that's a good way to leverage that and actually progress your agency, because now you're fixing things and then you have data, and then you can go back and say, hey, the next month after we've conducted this training, let's see if we have those same numbers. And if they go down, you're like, holy shit, this actually works. And then now you can track progress.
And
One
I
of
think
the
we
things
talked about that. Oh, go ahead, Rick.
I was just going to say, it's blown my mind since body worn cameras have come out that they're either their administrators or agencies refuse for them to be used at all because they are worried about liability, or they're used for gotcha, where somebody's
Yeah.
going through a scrolling and looking for somebody making mistakes. When we have everything we need to do such amazing work on lessons learned, on research, on observation, what sounds better? Based on talking to three other guys about domestic violence, or after reviewing 700 body worn camera videos of domestics, we've identified these issues, we've created training to adjust those things, and this, what sounds better in court? Right? That's one of the things I really like about Officer Involved, which is a page on Instagram. He puts out so much body worn camera and dash cam video. I don't know where he gets it. He gets a lot, from what I understand, it's a lot of officer initiated submissions, but he puts out so much stuff. Just watching Officer Involved camera video footage has really opened my eyes to a lot of what's happening in the world, but it also creates a great opportunity for doing research. If your agency doesn't allow you to go through the body worn camera as an instructor to do research and observation, and that's something that needs to be put into SOP or something like that, at least there's websites like Officer Involved, or I'm sorry, Instagram pages like Officer Involved, that actually allows you to do that. He has thousands of videos on there already, but I don't see a lot of people, and then you have a couple other pages that might break down a video here and there, but there's nothing better than having the background training and knowledge, background training and experience to be able to analyze all these BWC and dashcam videos and come up with evidence, evidence to substantiate why you're choosing to do in your training what you're doing. We're already doing that with, you see that a lot with practical shooting. Law enforcement agencies and instructors who are using body worn camera to talk about how do we add practical shooting like training into our firearms regimen, which leads to Graham v. Connor. If y'all had something else you want to add, Jamie, I think I cut you off though.
Yeah, I forgot what I was gonna say.
Oh, okay.
Just to
But
hit on
go
that, Rick.
real
Go,
quick
go ahead,
though,
Jamie.
just real quick. Officer Involved is really good. The BWC library on their website,
Yeah.
it has everything categorized. So if you want to go look up
Okay.
a DV call, or if you want to go look up a crisis entry or a hostage rescue or a breaching thing, it's all on there. So that's a good resource just on their website to be able to go look up. I look up stuff on there all the time.
Oh, very good. And there's a lot of stuff you can scan on YouTube. Matter of fact, I've been even in my book, I provide a YouTube link to a domestic violent or domestic nonviolent just to do practice and performance task analysis. It's part of the book. How do you go through and do that? And you write down all of the tasks and such. Did you have something you wanted to add, Bill?
Yeah, I just wanted to like highlight the importance of that, and I think one organization, I'm a little biased, but one organization that does it very well, I think, is the Marine Corps. And the Marine
Yeah,
Corps has a unit, MCCLL, the Marine Corps Center for Lessons Learned, that
yeah,
is a sole unit under TCOM that organizes data from training exercises, operations, and stuff like that to help create and update doctrine. And essentially, I think what we're talking about here is creating doctrine for
yeah,
us to train off
absolutely.
of. And it's so important because if we don't have training officers that are, one, creating doctrine, but two, staying current with it and realizing like, oh, you know, as they say in the Marine Corps, like the enemy has a vote, and tactics are constantly evolving. And if we're not staying current with that, then we're fighting the war of yesterday, not the one of today. And the analogy is the same for law enforcement, like tactics for burglaries, for you know crimes against people, trafficking, human trafficking, all that stuff is constantly changing because they're catching on to the ways that we're apprehending them. So if we're not using our failures to progress our doctrine, you know, and it sticks with that 8 hours every year, like we're never going to evolve, and there's going to come a point where we can't catch up.
Yeah. You know, we got to get out of this headspace in law enforcement where you can't speak ill of the dead, or you can't, you know, don't discuss people's mistakes because that could lead to liability. It's like, then we never move forward. How do
Yeah,
we get better if we can't discuss what's happened in the past? We're in the situation we are now because of that very mindset. And it
Mhm.
hasn't really improved at all. Until we can start being introspective and we can say we can break down your performance without calling you a turd.
yeah,
You made mistakes, but the mistakes, we need to find out why you made those mistakes and where they come from so we can fix them for everybody else. Because if one person is making the mistake, guarantee there's other people making those mistakes also. If it is only that person, let's remediate that person instead of inventing new policies saying you can't do what this one knucklehead did. We ran into that with my agency where that same instructor who was a crap instructor was did something stupid, and they wrote a policy banning everybody from being able to do anything because that one dude. Rather than just say, "Hey, you're a knucklehead, you're not allowed to do this anymore," they banned everybody from doing it. You know, and we see that a lot.
Yeah. I think applying that to training as well when you're teaching students, let them make the mistakes because
yep.
that's where you learn the most. Don't
Yeah,
be afraid of making the mistakes and push them to make the mistakes so they'll be like, okay, I screwed that up. Now I know what it feels like to mess it up in training. Now I won't mess it up in the real world.
yeah. Creating a safe place to fail. I want them to fail in training where we can
Yes,
fix it. Because when they fail on the street, it's somebody's life. It's somebody's
exactly.
treasure. You know, you mentioned something too that oh, what was it? Yeah, the creating a safe place to fail. Oh, by also looking at the mistakes of what happens out in the real world when the job is being done, it gives us information that we can address that in class. Not don't do this, but when they do things, we already have an answer for why they might have done that. If we see that people are making mistakes in this one way, we can watch for that in the class and we have a mitigation strategy already in place rather than without knowing why things are happening, knowing the mistakes that people are making, being able to break down and do a lessons learned. Everything is a new issue that we have to figure out just through time and experience. But with a lot of new instructors and with the average lifespan of an instructor is 2 years, we don't have time for them to build the experience in order to know why these mistakes are happening to be able to adjust to it.
Rick,
Yeah.
with one way, like something both of you guys said, I think Jamie had mentioned that you know the safe, it's creating the safe environment to fail is invaluable to officers and recruits. But one thing that can also help, especially with in service, if you're working with cops that are seasoned, is when you have that performance evaluation, like sheet, and it has the criteria for what is success on there and what is failure and what is in between. I'll try to equate it to like an FTO evaluation where you have like your 1 through 4, and a 1 has a criteria for this subject area, like use of time and distance, right? Like say that's an area that you're evaluating, and you have a numerical scale 1 through 5, and then on the back of your sheet you have what is a 1 for that particular thing you're evaluating. And then when you go to the student afterwards, it becomes less of a hierarchy, like you did this poorly and they could take it negatively, for like, hey, look on this sheet and tell me how you think you did, what was your performance like. And you'll often come to the same conclusion, and it kind of removes uh, the negativity that some seasoned officers can take when you tell them they performed that task poorly. Because you could see on the form, like, hey, dude, this is a 1, man. Hey, we got to work on this, but this is how we improve that. It's a way easier way to like not sugarcoat it, but get their buy-in for that training block and not dismiss it because you might be a younger instructor and they might be a seasoned cop and already be adversarial with you. I found that to be super helpful, and it also helps with if you need people to run your evaluations, they know exactly what to look for and they know exactly how to evaluate. And you don't have to be at every station by yourself. As long as you give a good briefing, you can
Yeah.
entrust others to run that for you and stay consistent.
Yeah, that's one of the things that Jamie and I talked about with this class is creating rubrics, because the rubrics make it an objective third-party tool based on general expectations, but it takes the onus off of I don't like you,
Yep.
because you could have somebody you don't like that performs exceptionally well. By using a rubric where you break down, this is what unsatisfactory looks like, here's all the details, this is what satisfactory looks like, and this is what excels looks like. It becomes a third party tool, but it also becomes a part of documenting in your course. One of the things I didn't talk about this, and I may or may not have in the book, but what if we took all of our training materials, the instructor guide, the participant guide, a sample of the participant guide, all the rubrics, all the evaluations, all the assessments, put it in an evidence bag, and then signed it into evidence? What if we did that? Now you don't have to have a filing cabinet of 1,000 things. You just have to have a date and an evidence number of all of your course material. So if Joe Bob, who went through your course 7 years ago through the agency, does something, you can just call up that evidence bag and you have everything right there in real time. You're right back to that training with all the rubrics. And if he was a knucklehead in class, but he barely skated, and he does something that wasn't covered in class, that you now have all of that narrated instructor guide, the narrated participant guide, and all the rubrics and assessments that that guy followed. Most of the time, all we keep track of is certifications, but that's a different case. That's further down the list. So the next case that I wanted to talk about was Graham v. Connor. We're all familiar with Graham v. Connor, a SCOTUS case, because this Graham v. Connor sets objective reasonableness. What we're seeing is that objective reasonableness is now being applied to training. Is the training objectively reasonable? When you add that to Popal v. Margate and Canton v. Harris, they start looking at, is it reasonable that what was trained should have been trained? Is it based on a performance task analysis from Canton v. Harris? Is it repeatable and is it realistic from Popal v. Margate? Is it following policy and procedure? See you later, man. Is it following policy and procedure according to Spell v. McDaniel? But we've always applied Graham v. Connor to use of force, but it's now being applied to how training is conducted and how training is designed, like Spell v. McDaniel. I
That's
don't think
interesting.
there's. Go ahead.
I never really thought about it that way. But yeah, if you apply objectively reasonable to training, like make sure all your training is objectively reasonable. And I think that goes to how often do you train certain things?
Yeah,
What's reasonable? Is it reasonable for us to train DT in the academy and never again? Is it reasonable to do a qual as you're training for your firearms for the year? Like none of that is reasonable. And I think one of the things that I wanted to say before, and we've all had this question, how do I improve training at my department? I think that right there is using objective reasonableness, going to your command staff and being like, hey, it is not reasonable for us not to do this. We need to
right.
do this to make it because it's reasonable. Other agencies are doing it. We should probably do this too.
Yeah, very much so.
And I'll hit on some active shooter stuff too that I think is important. And I, I'm a big fan of using that, for DT and everything like that. And then you'll have some people that will say, "Well, we don't have active shooters that often, so we're not gonna need to do that." And I would say that that's not what we're trying to say with the objective reasonableness. What we're trying to say with that is, hey, what's most likely? We're going to train that majority of the time. However, incidents like that consume every ounce of resource that the city or the agency has to offer. And it is such a profound incident that if we do not train it, the ramifications for not training that are so severe that we can't come back from that. So
Mhm.
so I want to just caution people that you need to be reasonable in what you prioritize. And just because an incident doesn't happen often doesn't mean that it should be overlooked. And you should, when you're analyzing what is important, I think frequency is one of the factors, but also has to be how taxing would this event be if it was to happen in our jurisdiction? And if it's a serious critical incident that has shown to be, happening throughout the country, we can't neglect it just because it hasn't happened in our area. So I just think, people should take that and analyze that appropriately, as opposed to like a hot air balloon crash. Like, how are we going to manage that? Well, that's a very different event than, say an active shooter, which we've seen a bunch of, and we see how devastating they are. And especially when we have incidents like Uvalde, where the things compound and we see failures compound on the front and the back end, how that could be. So, I just wanted to hit that because I thought that's important.
Yeah, absolutely. I was actually going to get to it if Jamie didn't. That's one of the things I liked about Jamie's course. That solo responder to active threat, right? Active shooter.
A lone protector, solo active shooter response.
Yeah, I just totally butchered it. You
It's all
say it
good.
much better. That's one of the things is he talked about Uvalde, but he didn't sit there talking about Uvalde. He's like, look at these turds. They don't know
Yeah.
anything. It was from the perspective of Graham v. Connor. Is it objectively reasonable to stand outside of a room where you have the guy locked in with 20 kids for 40 minutes? Is it objectively reasonable to do nothing while there's windows that someone could have gone around to and maybe engaged the guy? And then Jimmy talked about how Bortak hit the door, went in, and solved it. Is that the objectively reasonable way to handle it? And that's what his case was. That's what his entire course is based off of, is objectively reasonable response, not just is it going to happen here? It
Hmm.
never happens anywhere until it does.
Yep.
So it's a fallacious argument. Everyone should train on it, but what are they training? And that's part of the contention that Jamie has with other active shooter courses, who shall remain nameless right now, is that their courses are not objectively reasonable. It's based off of antiquated perceptions, a lack of research, and it's not being updated. And that's part of the objective reasonableness too, is how often are you updating your materials? We talk about creating training, we talk about delivering training, but how many people created training 5, 6 years ago who've never gone back and done a research observation analysis to make sure that their training is up to date and relevant? CQB has changed over the last 40 years. And every 5 years, something new happens where they're like, we got to change how we do CQB again. If you're training the same CQB from the 1980s, or if you're training firearms like they do it in the 1960s, where they're shooting from the hip from a really sexy, cool crouching position, that's not objectively reasonable. Things have moved on. We're not using revolvers in shootings as much anymore. Now we're facing people with fully automatic weapons with glot switches and such like that. So
I'm down to shoot from the hip though. That's a lot of fun.
it is. It is. I'm not saying it's unreasonable. I'm just saying
Just
is
don't
that
train it.
training alone reason those dudes were tearing up targets shooting from that. It's
Oh
all
yeah.
about
Oh
hand-eye
yeah.
coordination. If there's ever an argument about basics and fundamentals, that those old dudes, those are the ones delivering.
Yep.
So the next case we have is Clipper v. Tacoma Park. And this one's a fascinating one because it's another one that a lot of people are unaware of. Clipper v. Tacoma Park is a guy is there's a bank robbery. The detective got the description of who it was, of what the guys looked like. A couple of people were injured in a shootout, so they went and the detective talked to the guy that the getaway car was registered to, and then arrested him. The problem is that the guy had an alibi, and his alibi was another law enforcement officer in the agency who was gardening with him and other people at the time of the robbery. So when it went to court for unlawful arrest, the detective said, "Well, I wasn't trained on, what probable cause looked like." So the result is that because the agency couldn't prove that he was ever provided examples of probable cause and unlawful arrest, that the agency was liable. What that means is that we can provide examples, but we need to document what the examples are. But it also gets to, and it's implied, that we have to have assessments that actually measure the tasks that people are performing. In evaluating some courses, I'll see people talk about high level action verbs where they're saying the person will be able to write out an entire affidavit for search warrant. That's a performance again. They'll be able to create an affidavit for a search warrant. But the way they measure it in the course is a 10-question quiz where they do nothing but what is a search warrant? What is an affidavit? That's not showing that somebody can do that. That's not assessing their ability to understand and perform. So Clipper v. Tacoma Park really gets to you have to provide relevant and useful examples, but you also have to make sure that they know how those examples work, which implies your assessments have to actually measure what you're expecting people to do from that training. So in this case, they should have an example of this is how probable cause works, but then have an assessment of is this probable cause? And then that person has to analyze a case, has to analyze the scenario, and has to determine, yes, this is probable cause, or no, that's probable cause. And that's something that Bill's been working on a lot with his use of force, with his use of force legal course.
Yeah, I've been having to do that a lot because what I was finding with the legacy program that we were running is that there was very difficult times for them articulating the reasons why they made decisions. And so I started to look at like how were they being evaluated? And again, it was a test, and the test had nothing to do with articulation, had nothing to do with using those factors to guide your decision making. So as I started to rebuild it, and it's still in the works, but as I started to rebuild it, I started to work backwards from what I need them to know in their performance objectives, and then create the evaluations off of that, which helped me create the course content and materials and like how I'm going to teach that. And what I found is that the test is a good way to measure, memorization. But when I started to go into like open-ended questions and questions that required thought and critical thinking, where every answer was long form and the question was scenario or long form, it forces the student to at least make a decision a little bit more, and then couple that with a performance evaluation of those specific set of skills and those performance objectives that you're measuring. So what I did was then I took the test and I associated performance objectives and the goals and objectives with the questions on the test, and then recreated the scenarios for practical application using those same things so they're kind of congruent. So they can get evaluated on the articulation aspect and the performance aspect through the test and their practical application. So it's still in the works, but I've pretty much done with that portion of it, and it's so far it's been proven, so a very small data pool, but it's been shown so far that they can articulate things much better, and I think they have a deeper understanding, excuse me, of what's expected of them, and they know what right looks like, so they're able to replicate it when they go through their prac app and are evaluated.
Yeah, one of the things you touched on was the practical application portion of it. One of the things we discussed, and Jamie and I discussed this when I came out and observed them teaching the same thing, the legal side of use of force, was that rather than just read the case to them, one of the things that you started doing is you have people recreate
Yeah.
the case. And then they're observing in real time. Now, it's not 100% what happened, but people read the case, they perform it, and then other people evaluate and make decisions based on that. It actually leads into the next case, but I want to real quick see if Jamie has anything to add.
I got anything to add, but I'll be right back though.
Okay. So one of the things that like we were talking about, applying case law changes to your training doesn't have to be redesigning everything. It's fixing things as you go. Because as you're dealing with this, you use the term you're working backwards. That's actually a theory of instructional design. It's based more in education where they have the content, but it's a design backwards is a thing. I call it analysis. What do I want them to do? And then that determines, okay, if I want them to do this, how am I going to test that? Well, I need to test them doing that thing. So what do they need to have to be able to do all that? They need this kind of content. They need this kind of stuff. Well, this is what the performance objective says. So that adds to going and looking at what the performance objective says and then determining, is it actually being measured, which is exactly what you're doing. So you've implemented a lot of Tacoma v, Clipper v Tacoma Park, in that you're adjusting your assessments and you're providing examples, and the examples are the actual cases.
Mhm.
We actually just did that for this class, and I used the senior class to replicate the cases, and then had the junior class observe, and then we were able to discuss it. And I debriefed the senior class afterwards, and I was asking them how their experience was, and majority of them were saying that once I tasked them with, hey, you guys have to recreate this case on this day and time, it forced them to then deep dive into the case to make sure that what they're doing is accurate. And even down to the points on like Graham versus Connor was the one that we recently did, and they were saying, even the part where Graham runs around the car twice before he sits on the curb, like they recreated those things, and all of those things, just like Graham talks about, the totality of the circumstances are considered. When you see that happen and unfold in front of you, it helps articulate and explain why things are happening. It was very helpful for both sides of that when it was going on. So it was not a big lift to be able to do that. It was actually pretty easy. What we did was we also recorded it so that we can use it as a video example for further classes too.
Awesome. Very good. Jimmy, did you have anything you want to add?
Nope, I missed
Okay.
part of it. So
So the next case is exactly what you talked about, decision making. Zuckel v. Denver, 1993. It was involved, Zuckel, the police officer approached a guy named Zuckel. Zuckel made a movement, and the officer shot him. And by all accounts, the guy, when he lifted up his arms, was surrendering. He was not going for any kind of weapon. Nobody saw a weapon on him. But the results of that case was that training that requires situational decision making should be a part of training. Training has to have decision making. Now, one of the things about Zuckel is that this is a 10th Circuit federal appellate case, but everything we do in law enforcement requires decision making. Why did it have to take till 1993 before we recognized that training needs to have decision making? So that's one of the critical things that Bill has been adding to his use of force legal training, is there has to be decision making. That's one of the things we talked about in our very first live, is that if we're not training decision making, how do we know to go from verbal de-escalation to manual de-escalation? Without decision making, we're not accomplishing what training really should be about. We can't train to every circumstance. SCOTUS has already established that. We cannot train to every circumstance. But what they do expect is that we provide them enough examples and enough opportunities to make decisions that they make good decisions, according to Graham v. Connor. So with by adding decision making, that could be, you can still use the multiple choice quiz. You just have to write more complicated stems, which are the question, and more complicated options where people have to make a decision based on what they've learned in class. Now, that's a very subtle way of doing that. Something that Bill has been working on extensively. We call it the GRE method of testing, because another piece of learning science is that your tests aren't just about checking a box that they attended and learned something. It's also a useful tool for learning. By adding decision making into your assessments and into your quizzes, you're encouraging learning by creating that repetition and that reinforcement.
Yeah, one of the things that I found helpful with that style of test is that it progressively gets more difficult, but as it gets more difficult through the test, you can use previous questions to assist you in answering the question you might be struggling with. So it is progressive and it builds off each other. And the people that I did give that to as a beta test, their first comments back was, I learned more from that test, which I had never gotten before. I've never gotten somebody tell me that they learned from the test. So I thought that was really interesting that that was their first comment, positive comment about it.
I think too often in law enforcement, everything's a check the box, right? A, B, and C, true or false, make it nice and easy on that test. Scenarios are really easy. You go to the range, you got shoot, no shoot targets, but really our entire job is processing information and making a good decision. So
Yeah.
everything that you do has to be based on that. We need to get out of the mindset of teaching officers how to check boxes and make them critical decision makers and not just robots that, hey, on a high risk vehicle stop, I have to do this, 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 this. Well, every high risk vehicle stop I've ever been on has been a little bit different. So I've had to
Yep.
process the information and adjust based on what I'm seeing. And if you're not including decision making in your trainings and making the officers come up with different decisions, it may not be the same decision that you would have made, but as long as it's reasonable, making them make decisions instead of, hey, you do it this way every time, it's training is going to be a lot better if you do it that way and make them think rather than make them just do.
It's one of the things I've noticed in a lot of since 2020. We've seen a lot of hiring practices are not about decision making anymore. It's about identifying information. That's
Hmm.
one of the things I think is absolutely crucial is that there's less decision making. There are less scenarios being involved to determine whether or not this person is capable of making good decisions based on the available information. And if they don't get enough information out of the available information, are they capable of analyzing it enough to ask the questions that they need to in order to make better decisions? So one of the things that it blows my mind, every single training opportunity we have has opportunity for decision making. In the courses I evaluate and the courses I've reviewed, corporate and law enforcement, overwhelmingly, the thing missing is decision making. It's like, is it this thing or that thing? It's never going to be this thing or that thing. It's going to be this thing based under these circumstances with this situation based on the policy that may have changed last week.
Hmm.
We have to train decision making. We can't train facts, and we just training facts doesn't give anybody enough information to be able to apply those facts. We have to give them the skill of critical thinking, and that's what that case came down to. Training should include decision making, critical thinking, and opportunities to apply the new skills and knowledge in different scenarios, and should be repeated regularly. Getting back to our original case.
Yep.
That kind of speaks to, I know Jamie's program does this for DT, but when we're talking about like apprehending folks and when we're taking people down and when we're not, like I think when we simplify things and we make them principle and conceptually based, it allows that decision making to actually happen. Because what we found when we first did this and we were teaching everything from escaping the mount to guard and all this shit that I enjoy doing on my free time, but not really applicable to cops, is there's too many options. So the decision making kind of goes out the window. They just resort to what they remember the most, which might not be the right choice. But when we give them conceptual options like, hey, if they're right next to a wall, why don't we try to handcuff them against the wall instead of fight to bring them on on the ground when there's no room in the single family apartment on the third floor, but
Hmm.
there's a clean wall right here. So like use the environment and teach it in a conceptual way so that they can have a binary approach, A or B, for each stipulation that they encounter and make it more broad. So that way they are critically thinking in the moment, but they're also critically thinking in training. So once they understand those skills, they can apply it in training, let them make mistakes, and then correct the concept that they applied, not the technique, because nothing's going to look pretty when it's for real. And that learning process is huge. And I know you guys do a very, very good job at that. And there's not many places that are. So I'm sure you found a lot of success with your program.
Yeah, if you keep it conceptually based, it doesn't matter if you're on the wall or on the ground or the
Yep.
back of a Tahoe or sitting down on a park bench, all the concepts are the same. So just apply it differently based on where you're at. And it just got me thinking before here, we are talking about explosive breaching. I always bring it back to whenever I'm talking about reasonableness, I bring it back to that because there's so many people that don't understand how to be a good explosive breacher. And they'll be like, okay, it's 100 grains on rubber every time. Well, what's reasonable?
Yep.
Like I could go a little bit more, I could go a little bit less, I could go out the hinge side, I could go change the charge and do this. What's reasonable? But if I only tell them one way of doing things, or I tell them, here's 500 ways to do things on the opposite end,
Yeah.
they're not going to know what to do when the time comes. But if you keep it principle based, teach them reasonable, and like someone just said, principles are universal. Stick with those universal principles and let people flow within that, and they'll be fine.
Yeah, very good. So we have 2 cases left, and we're going to get through them pretty quickly. What it comes down to is that the thing that everyone should take away from this is everything we're talking about sounds like it should just be common sense. But we know that it's not common sense because there's a vast majority of instructors who aren't doing any of this stuff. Jamie's course was doing it naturally, and Bill and I, when we started talking, he already had the ideas. He just didn't know how to put it down in the order in the process that would work for him. So the next case is Paul v. City of Altus. This one is about documentation. It was essentially City of Altus police officer pulled over a car, told the passenger to get out. The passenger said, "I can't, I'm quadriplegic." The cop went through the window, pulled him out, put his knee on his neck, and shattered another vertebra. So he was definitely quadriplegic by the end of it. The problem was is that there were 2 standards. They were CLETA certified that he had done it, he had violated policy, but then the course that they taught at the agency said he did not violate policy. There is no quality documentation about what was trained in the course. All they had to go off of is what the agency policy said and what CLETA certified them that they should be doing. So the lack of documentation let the officer off and the agency was held liable. I think I'm yelling again. I apologize. So the thing that we have to remember, and this is where all the my commentary about documentation comes from, is if you don't have it documented, it doesn't exist. It's your word against an attorney who's going to do everything he can to twist you around. So the better you have your documentation aligned with policy, aligned with case law, legal liability, use of force, Fourth Amendment type case law, and training case law, the tighter it'll be able, the more likely they'll be able to determine where the liability really sits. The agency ate the liability when I think most of us reasonably would have thought ripping a guy who says he's quadriplegic out of a window is not a good idea, especially when he's not moving after you pull him out and put him on the ground. But without a documentation, and like Bill had mentioned before, and we've talked about on previous, is your training materials, if they're documented the way we've talked about, it becomes your doctrine. SOP only covers what not to do and what to do. How to do it, why to do it, is what the training doctrine is about.
Mhm.
Y'all have any commentary for that?
I think you hit it all. I mean,
Yeah.
I think it goes back to when you came to my course, the documentation wasn't there, and I realized that I failed at that, and I need to do better at documenting exactly the why behind what I'm doing, even though that I know, and I know that Mike, who teaches with me in that class, he knows the why, but I need to document it better so that if something does happen, it doesn't fall back on me later.
Exactly.
The documentation piece that really stood out for me, in DT again, but was with injuries. So as the course goes through, as we're teaching it, we're recording on the days because depending on the student ability and stuff like that, sometimes things shift left and right a little bit. So we're documenting what we're teaching at the timestamp that we're teaching it, and then if we sustain an injury at any portion, we write down where it's happening. And there was a particular block early on where we were seeing a high degree of injuries, and then we started to like look at our scenarios and our performance evals if those things were necessary, and we found out that they weren't necessary. So we were essentially causing unnecessary injury, or it was a high risk injury, high injury prone event. So we ended up getting rid of it, which reduced our overall injury rate significantly. And having that documentation was my first exposure to, oh shit, I have to be a little bit more squared away with this, because if I am, I can like help mitigate some of the stuff and answer questions when people ask like what's happening with it. So that was what started me with that. The rest of the documentation stuff is stuff I'm working on. It's all new because mine was not adequate at all either.
But that's how 99% of instructors do it, because that's how 99% of instructors were trained.
Mhm.
We
Yep.
were trained by people who were also not doing it. And they were trained by people who were also not doing it, because nobody stepped up and said, actually, this is the way it should be done. And this is how you can fix it to do it. That's what we're doing here right now, is that we're making it clear that this stuff exists. So anybody who's been on this live and anybody who's bought the book, they're now on notice that they have evidence that they should be doing it this way, right?
Well, and just to give you a quick example of something that happened to me recently, I was asked to help teach a class, and I was given the PowerPoint that they've been teaching for probably the last 15 years, and it had 170 slides on it, which I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to teach that. So I redid the whole thing, and I found case law that had changed. I found a whole bunch of different things that had changed in that PowerPoint, and I updated that training. But I had to redocument everything. And, if you're not updating your training and updating your documentation, you're still going to be teaching stuff that's 15 years old and not even know it, because you're just passing it on to the next guy.
Mm-hmm.
And then one of the guys was like, "Yeah, I've been meaning to do that for a long time." I'm like, well, why don't you just do it? Just you're
Yeah.
the one that teaches this class, it's not
Yeah.
me. You should probably have updated that.
Well, he just got free labor, didn't he?
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Yeah. So the last case that we're going to talk about is probably the most powerful case for you as instructors. It's Flores versus City of San Diego, and the case is specifically about whether or not you have to follow post or academy standards. If post sets the standards, you have to meet the standards. But they said in the case, you can exceed the standards, you just can't go below the standards. So regardless of what the standards are, and that Bill's been working on that a lot too, and I know that Jamie's working with AZ Post a lot, is that even if the standards are not very great, we can do better. We just can't do less than. The case is specifically about a pursuit policy, where California Post said that training for pursuit policy has to be within so much time, and it has to have this kind of stuff in it. San Diego had their own pursuit policy, which is a 20-minute video that they watched once a year. There was a pursuit. The end result was that two people on a motorcycle who were being pursued died. The family won the suit, and the agency paid liability, because the agency said, well, that only applies to academy. That doesn't apply to agencies. And the court came back, and I don't have let me pull up, I can't remember. I think it was an appeals case.
It's a Ninth Circuit,
Looks like Fifth.
Fifth Circuit.
Yeah. So let me pull it up real quick. It's a Court of Appeal, Fourth District, Division One, California. So they said that you can't do less than what Post is certified. If Post is training it in the academy, it applies to all agencies also, because that's the basic training. However, you can improve on it. If they say that you need 4 hours of pursuit training and you do 6 with evoc and scenarios, that is perfectly okay. The thing is that when you start doing that, you're raising the standards beyond the least common denominator. You're moving it beyond minimum qualification, and part of that documentation from City of Altus I already spaced it. Paul v. City of Altus, is that if you document everything, especially the why, and it's based off of research, observation, and analysis, you've created a standard that you can set for your agency that you can now hold everybody accountable to, because it's not an arbitrary standard. If somebody says, well, I only have to meet the minimum standard, and the agency says, no, based on our research observation analysis, this is the standard that we're going to live by, then they're perfectly safe. They should be perfectly safe if they have a quality attorney. I can't say perfectly because, there's always that wild hair. So, and that's one of the things that Bill especially had really focused on, and that Jamie has embraced with his training, is that you can have a minimum standard. That doesn't mean you have to be at the minimum standard. You can improve that and create better standards. I'd like y'all to talk about that for a minute.
Yeah, the thing that like kind of one of my pet peeves is like when instructors are like, "Well, the qualification is so low, I'm stuck with this," and it's like, well, yeah, you're stuck with that for a minimum passing qualifications standard, but you're not. That's not limiting your ability and capability of what you can teach to the students. And I'm sure anybody that has ever been a competitive sports athlete or competitive in any way will know that if you are training to the bare minimums to walk in, you're not going to be competitive. And if we take that same concept and you train your people to the highest ability you can do, that qualification becomes a non-issue. It becomes a very easy task for people to be able to do. But when your pinnacle of training is the qual in whatever area that you're working in, the ability of your people to go beyond that is not realistic, because they haven't been exposed to anything other than that. Firearms is the easiest way to equate it, because you put them on the range and they have 45 seconds to shoot 9 rounds from the 25-yard line, but then you give them a sim gun and put them in a scenario and they're cranking the trigger as fast as they can, and they're all mics and they're wondering why. And it's like, well, you trained them to this, but you expect them to be able to do that. They don't match. So I call kind of bullshit on instructors that use that as a crutch to not do it. And a lot of them might not know. I didn't know for a while too. So, but there are ways to do it, but you got to be a little creative, and you got to put yourself in the hot seat and be able to do what you're teaching.
If you if you train to that minimum standard, you're going to get minimum standard results in
Yep.
everything. So you have to train, even if the standard is low, keep your training high. Continue to push your training to evolve and continue to be better than what the minimum standard is, and people will rise to it. Just because you have to, just because the standard is low, like let's take a pistol qual for instance, doesn't mean that you have to train just to do the qual.
Yep.
You can train to do more. You can train to do better. Just because defensive tactics, like the basics is simple, it doesn't mean you can't go to PJ or go do jujitsu on the side, or can't grow or start training something different in your organization. Push your people to do better. And then guess what? When it comes to qual time, when it comes to meeting the standard, they're going to exceed it and everybody's going to love them for it. And I got
Yep.
to give credit to Ryan Clark. One of the things that he's continuing to push here is train getting rid of the qual altogether, having posts set the standard, whatever standard that is, and then let the agencies decide what they want their qual to be. And if they want their qual to be harder than the minimum standard, then good. Then guess what's going to happen to the next agency over? The next agency is going to say, well, why is this agency doing this and we're not? Then it's going to start to raise everybody. So just because the
100%.
standard is low doesn't mean that you can't train above it.
Yeah, you look at every athlete who's going to be drafted. How many athletes say, "I want to go to the worst team"? They don't. Nobody wants to go to the worst team.
Yeah.
If you're going to go play baseball, you want to play for the people who go to the World Series all the time. You don't want to go for the guys who are always last. High performers want to work with high performers. And until training understands that, and until admin understands that, if we're training people at minimum standards and we're training them to just what post requires, we're getting C-level performers. As long as we're training above C level, they're perfectly within. We can always rise higher. We can't go lower. So why not train your people to B level? Because B level is where your meets expectations people are. C level is minimum standards. It's not they're not just meeting standards, they're doing enough to not get fired. That's what a C level performer is. That's
Yep.
what minimum standards are. I'm doing enough to not get fired. We want people we're always going to have B-level performers who are doing the job well. They're not super great at everything, but they're not sucking at everything too. They're strong, stable, reliable employees. A performers are always going to be outliers, but we want the outliers to perform so we can see what's possible.
Hmm.
B is where we want people. C is like you're doing enough to survive, but we're going to start raising the standards. And if you can't make that, what's going to be to survive is eventually going to be what everybody is at B.
Yep.
And that 100% goes for instructors as well.
Yeah,
If we want
absolutely.
standard instructors, we're going to keep putting standard instructor training on. If you want better instructors, you have to one, draw in quality instructors, people that know how to teach beforehand, and there has to be some sort of standard for an instructor course. It can't just be I show up to the course, I learn the material, and I walk away. There has to be an evaluation. There has to be the ability to fail people out of instructor courses because some people just shouldn't be instructors. And
Yep.
if we want to raise the bar for the officers at the lower level, we need to raise the standard for our instructor level training as well.
Yeah, there are minimum standards to be an instructor, and there are a lot of minimum standard instructors out there. And a lot of them are creating training companies to train civilians and other cops and getting paid $1,000 for a 2-day course. It's like, why do you think that you're capable of this? They've never gone beyond minimum standards, and it
Mhm.
shows. That's
Yep.
one of the great things about Instagram. It exposes the minimum standard instructors quickly, and then they
Yep.
block everybody.
Yeah. Mhm.
Awesome. Well, that's all I have for case law. I think we did a good job talking about how we can get all this implemented. And Bill, Jamie, you've done an outstanding job explaining how possible it is to implement change within your training without having to completely redo everything. It's if you can start with that as your baseline of is my training doing this for all your new courses, that saves a lot of time. But both of you have been exemplar in adapting and recognizing that this is an opportunity to not just protect your own asses, but also to improve the quality of your training. Because
Mhm.
improving the quality of training is raising that bar. And your training is A class instead of B class, and definitely way above the majority of C class.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. It's a work in progress, but we're
Mhm.
getting there.
That's if you felt like you were done, you might want to check what you're missing.
Yeah. Still got a
Yeah.
long way to go.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, guys. Well, appreciate you being on again. We'll get this up on YouTube here and start sharing it out in the next couple of days. You guys have fun taking your kids out. Good job dodging the war crimes of missing out on Halloween.
Yeah. Thank you guys.
I'll talk to you guys later.
But
All right,
take care.
Bye.
guys.
Bye.
Later.